Okay, hello everybody. I think we're going to go ahead and get started so we can be respectful of everybody's time. I will go ahead with an intro and then I'll turn it over to Jonah and get into the webinar. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sophia Yannick and I am a Senior Insight Manager and Manager of our Global Partnerships Program here at Olson Zaltman. I'll be playing the role of the moderator today and introducing the guest, as I mentioned, for our webinar, Jonah Berger. Just a little bit of background on our guest. He is a marketing professor at Wharton and an internationally best-selling author, consultant for organizations like Apple, Google, Nike, and Amazon, along with a world-renowned expert on change, spending over 2 decades studying influence, word of mouth, natural language processing, and consumer behavior. He has published over 50 articles in top-tier academic journals, teaches Wharton's most popular online course at the University of Pennsylvania, and popular accounts of his work often appear in places like the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Harvard Business Review. Over 1 million copies of his books are in print in over 40 countries around the world. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jonah Berger to kick off the webinar today. Jonah, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thanks for that kind and generous introduction. Sorry we can't be in person today, but hopefully in the next few months things will open up a little bit more and that will be possible. But while we are in different cities, potentially even different states and maybe even different countries around the world, I think all of us here today have something in common, which is that we all have something that we want to change. So as marketers, representatives of brands, we may have a product or a service that we want to catch on. We may want to change consumer behavior more generally in a space, a vertical, or an industry. Employees want to change their colleagues or their bosses' minds. Bosses want to transform organizational culture. Startups want to change industries, and nonprofits want to change the world. But change is really hard. Often we push, we pressure, and we cajole, and nothing happens. And so the question I'm going to ask is, could there be a better way? Could there be a better way to change minds and drive action, not by pushing, but by doing something else? And so as nicely mentioned, I'm Professor Jonah Berger. I'm a marketing professor at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. And what I'm going to do today in the hour we have together is give you a recent tour of my recent New York Times and Wall Street Journal bestseller, The Catalyst: How to Change Anyone's Mind. My hope today is it's very much of an interactive discussion. I will try to make my remarks somewhat brief, probably talk around a half hour, 35 minutes, and then I would love to spend some time at the end answering questions. I know the team at Olson Zaltman has been doing a book club around this, so I think they're already primed with questions, and hopefully this will be a little bit thought-provoking for the rest of you guys as well, but would love to introduce you guys to this different approach to thinking about change, and really begin to move in the direction of how to apply it. So please be thinking of questions. Feel free to throw them in the chat along the way if that's easier. Also, feel free to reach out to me directly. You can find me at J1Berger on Twitter, or I'll throw my email address in at the end as well. Love talking about these ideas. Happy to answer questions. If there's anything I can do to help, don't hesitate to ask. So before we dive into change, though, I want to give a quick plug for not what I'm going to talk about today, but maybe what I'll talk to you guys about 5 years from now. Which is a lot of the work that we're doing at the moment, as was nicely mentioned, is around natural language processing or automated textual analysis. What do I mean by that? Well, almost everything we do involves language in one way or another. At the moment, I am producing language. I am speaking to you using my voice, and I am showing you words on the screen. You are consuming language. You are reading those words on the screen, and hopefully once in a while, at least listening to some of the things I'm saying. We communicate as marketers to consumers through ads. Consumers call customer service. They read online content. We think about content marketing and news articles online. We read books. We watch movies and television shows. We listen to songs. All of these things contain language. And so what we're doing is extracting that language and leveraging it for customer insight. So we've done work, for example, showing what words customer service agents use on calls make customers more satisfied. In written content, both in terms of content marketing as well as other types of online content, what leads to longer reads? How can we write articles that'll be more engaging? We've looked at movie scripts to figure out what makes a blockbuster. We've looked at song lyrics to figure out what makes a hit. And we've looked at a variety of other types of information, from television shows, legal proceedings, even doctor-patient interactions, mining that text for insight. I'm not going to talk about this today very much. So if this doesn't sound interesting to you, good news, you're not going to hear much more of it. But if this does sound interesting to you, I'm not going to be able to talk about it much in the time we have today, but feel free to reach out. Would be happy to share some of the research we're doing. Would love to talk about what we found and what we're doing in this space. Okay, so to get back to change, you're on a hero's journey today. You have something you want to change. You are the hero, but unfortunately, there is a villain in every hero's journey. And the villain today is something called the status quo bias. Have any of you guys heard of the status quo bias? Feel free, if you have, to throw, I don't know if the chat here is open, but feel free to throw either in the Q&A or chat, if possible, if you have any idea what the status quo bias is, if you've heard of this term before. But even if you haven't, I bet you get some sense of what it is based on just the words that are there, which is that we have a bias towards the status quo. Anytime we make a decision, a choice, think about doing something in a particular space, we have a bias to the things we've been doing already. So as consumers, for example, we tend to buy the same products and use the same services. We tend to shop at the same grocery stores, buy the same things at those grocery stores, go to similar restaurants, and go to the same places every year for vacation. Why? It's easier. It's easier to stick with things we've done already. We know them, we know the ins and outs, and it doesn't take as much work. Right? Think, for example, if you ever tried to go to a different grocery store than you usually do, how much more work is involved? Something as simple as just going to a different grocery store. I don't know anywhere the items are. It takes me a while to find them. I did this a couple of weeks ago. It was intensely frustrating because I wanted to find the things I wanted to find, and it was much more difficult than usual, simply because it was a different store. And not only are old things or the status quo, is it easier, we also become attached to those things, right? We become attached to the products that we own, the brands that we're used to. Research on home buying and selling, for example, in real estate finds that the longer someone's lived in a home, the more they value it above market price. Why? They become attached to it. It's their home, right? And so same thing with brands, right? I'm attached to the brands I already know, which is great for those brands, but it's tough for us trying to help new brands and new products and services catch through. The same is true within organizations, right? We tend to stick with projects and initiatives we've done in the past, even if they're not necessarily working, and be loath to start new ones. So as organizations ourselves, as we're trying to build partnerships or get new clients, it's tough. They tend to stick with existing service providers and be wary of new ones. And so how can we overcome this status quo bias? How can we get people to change? Well, usually when we think, let me see if I can move this here. This, for some reason, staying down in the corner of the screen. Okay. Usually when we think about change, we think about a particular approach. And that approach is what I'll call pushing. So I've asked thousands of executives, for example, think about something that you want to change and think about something you either could do to create that change or have done already to create that change. And over 98% of the time, people list some version of pushing. What I mean by pushing, adding more facts, more figures, more reasons, making one more phone call, one more pitch, one more ad, one more email. If I could just explain to someone why they should do what I want them to do, they will come around, right? And it's clear why we think pushing works. So in the physical world, for example, if let's say there's a chair in the middle of a room and we want to move that chair, pushing is a great way to get that chair to go. If I apply force to that chair in the direction I want the chair to move, it often goes in the direction I want it to go. And so we apply the same idea to people. I would say, great, I'll just push people, just like I push chairs. If chairs move, people will move. Think about it for a second. Do people just slide across the floor like chairs do? Right? Think about yourself. When someone tries to push you, tries to convince you to do something, tries to push you in a particular direction, what do? What do most people do? Well, they often push back. They often dig in their heels. They often resist. They often put a whole bunch of force in the opposite direction, leading them not to move at all, and then sometimes go in the opposite direction of what we want them to. Right? And so if pushing doesn't work, what does? Well, it turns out there's an interesting analogy to be made to chemistry. And I'm not an expert in chemistry, but I have some friends who are chemists, and maybe some of you know a little bit about chemistry. You're probably aware that change in chemistry is really hard. Think about a diamond, for example, right? It's made through eons of temperature and pressure, squeezing carbon till it becomes a diamond. It takes a long time and a lot of work. And so in the lab, chemists, to make change happen faster, often add temperature and pressure, right? They heat something up, they squeeze it together in the lab to facilitate change occurring faster than millions of years. But there's a special set of substances that chemists often use that not only make change happen faster and easier, but do it in a particularly interesting way. These substances do everything from clean the grime on your contact lenses to clean your car's engine, and multiple Nobel Prizes have been won for innovations in this space. And what's most interesting about these substances, they don't heat things up, they don't add more temperature, they don't add more energy, they don't push more. Instead, they, in some sense, identify the barriers to change and they mitigate them, right? They allow the same amount of change to happen with less energy, not more. And these substances are called, as you can probably guess already, catalysts. Right? And as we think about catalysts in the social world, we often use it very colloquially. Oh, a person is a catalyst. What do we mean? They're a change agent, right? But if we think to the chemistry meaning, right, effective catalysts don't just create change. They do so in a particular way. They don't just say, well, let me push harder. What could I do to get someone to change? Instead, they take a subtly but importantly different approach. They say, well, why hasn't that person changed already? What's stopping them? What are the barriers or obstacles that are getting in the way of change, and how can I mitigate them? If I'm a marketer or a product manager, what's preventing someone from adopting this thing I want them to adopt, and how can I remove those barriers to make change more likely? A good analogy, if you think about it, imagine you're parked in a car, for example, and you want to get your car to go. Often we stick our key in the ignition, we turn our key, we step our foot on the gas, and we think the car will go. If the car doesn't go, we think, well, I just need more gas. Right? If I just step on that gas pedal enough, the car will move. But if the parking brake is pulled up, I can step on that gas all I want. Car's not going to go anywhere. And so the main idea I'm going to talk about today is how can we be better at finding and identifying those parking brakes? How can we figure out those barriers, those obstacles, those brakes that are getting in the way, that are preventing change from happening, right? And make change more likely, not by adding more gas, but by removing those barriers. And in writing this book, I talked to an amazing set of change agents. I talked to top-selling salespeople and transformational leaders. I talked to marketers that got very difficult products and services to catch on. And I also talked to some more unusual change agents, hostage negotiators, substance abuse counselors, parenting experts. Again and again, I saw the same 5 barriers come up. And so in the catalyst, I put them in a framework called the REDUCE framework. That stands for reactants, endowment, distance, uncertainty, and corroborating evidence. Each of these 5 things is a barrier that often gets in the way of change. Put them together, they spell the word reduce, which is exactly what great catalysts do. They don't push harder. They don't add more facts, more figures, more reasons. They identify the barriers, the roadblocks, and they reduce them. They get them out of the way. And I think, often as marketers, as change agents, we think we have an information problem. If I just give that consumer or customer more information, they will change. And sometimes it is an information problem, right? If we think about the beginning of a customer journey or the funnel, awareness is a key step. If someone's not aware of something, they can't take the action we want them to do. But often awareness isn't the issue. Often information isn't the issue. We're so focused on the change we want to have happen that we don't pay as much attention to why someone is reticent to change. And the more we understand about those barriers, the more effectively we can create change. So I won't have time today to talk about all 5 barriers because we only have a brief period together. I will talk about reactants. I will at least briefly talk about uncertainty, and then I will wrap up. But there's a whole book with all 5 barriers in it that you can check out. There's also a whole bunch of free resources on my website. So application guides, one-pagers with more information about each barrier and how to apply the framework and how to apply it to different settings. So maybe if the folks from Olson Zaltman wouldn't mind dropping that in the chat, or I can drop it in the chat along the way, you can find stuff there. And again, happy to help more with questions at the end. So let's just dive in. And I want to talk for at least a couple minutes about reactants, which is the first barrier. And to talk about it, I want to use an example that at least hopefully some of you are at least slightly familiar with. So does anyone know what these are? These things on the screen in front of you. Anyone have any idea what these are? Makes sense. You might be saying they're laundry pods or Tide Pods. You'd be exactly right. These are Tide Pods. Let me tell you a quick story about Tide Pods. Looks like at least Jessica and Juliana, a couple people have some sense of what Tide Pods are. Great. So Tide, owned by Procter & Gamble, wanted to make laundry faster and easier. Laundry's not that difficult, but there's a couple problems. You never know how much detergent to add. Sometimes you spill it on the counter, and it turns out to be better if some detergent went in early and others went in late. So they did some R&D. They solved these problems. They came out with these things called Tide Pods. Basically, set it and forget it. toss one of these little squares into the laundry, you're done. Don't have to worry about anything else. They spent $100 million in marketing, and they thought it could take a big chunk of the over $1 billion laundry industry. Okay, so Tide Pods come out and they're doing okay, but then they hit a snag, which is that people are eating them. And I want to pause just here for a second. You're probably saying, well, people are eating them. Aren't they filled with chemicals? They are, and yet people are still eating them. So there was a funny video online saying they look good enough to eat. There was a picture of someone melting them over pizza. And suddenly, mostly young people were challenging one another to eat Tide Pods. It was called the Tide Pod Challenge. Okay, now imagine you're a Tide executive in this situation. You're sitting there going, people are eating Tide Pods? You got to be kidding me. What should we do? Well, just to be safe, we'll release an announcement saying don't eat Tide Pods. And in case that's not enough, we'll hire a celebrity, this gentleman, Gronkowski, to shoot a public service announcement telling people don't eat Tide Pods. Should you ever eat Tide Pods? No. What about just for fun? No. Don't eat Tide Pods. Okay. So they told people not to do it. They hired Gronk. Gronk told people not to do it. They thought that would be enough. And they sort of said, great. Well, this is the data for the Tide Pod Challenge over time, for searches of it over time. And you see sort of an interesting pattern. There's sort of a mild increase in searches for the Tide Pod Challenge up until the point in which Tide releases their announcement. And Tide's hope is that this announcement will make people less interested in the Tide Pod Challenge. But that's not what happened. In fact, the exact opposite happened. Searches for the Tide Pod Challenge went up over 400%. And it wasn't just interested parents wondering what their kids were up to. Visits to poison control shot up as well. In the next 2 weeks, more people came into poison control than had in the 2 years prior. Essentially, a warning became a recommendation. Telling people not to do something made them more likely to do it. Now, you might be sitting there going, well, this is a fun example. Yeah, this is cute, but I mean, what does that have to do with me, right? As someone trying to change consumer or customer behavior, I'm not really trying to tell people not to do something. I'm trying to tell them to do something. And what do I care about Tide Pods, right? That's not the particular client or product or brand I'm working on. Well, this is just one example of a much broader phenomenon called reactants, right? And the idea behind reactants is when pushed, people push back. Whether we push them to do something or we push them not to do something, when pushed, people do often the exact opposite of what we want. And if this example isn't already making you think of public service announcements around vaccines and masks and everything that's happened during the coronavirus, I don't know what will. This is basically a perfect analog to what's happened recently, right? Public health organizations, for the most part, some recent campaigns have been different, but for the most part early on, use the same playbook that has failed for decades, which is if we want people to do something, tell them to do it. And if we want people not to do something, tell them not to do it, right? And while that seems like a good idea, it often doesn't work. So let's spend a couple minutes talking about why and what we might be able to do instead. So at the core, reactants is about agency and control. People like to feel like they're in control. Why did I buy a product? Why did I use a service? I did it because I wanted to. I am in the driver's seat of my life. But as soon as we, whether we are a marketer, whether we are a colleague, whether we are a boss, tells people to do something, right? Now it's less clear who's in the driver's seat. Well, hold on. Am I in the driver's seat making my choices? Or are you, marketer, boss, colleague, in the driver's seat? And the more I feel like you are driving what I'm doing, the less interested I am in doing it. Essentially, people have an ingrained anti-persuasion radar, almost like a missile defense system or a spidey sense that goes off when they feel like someone is trying to persuade them. And so they engage in a series of defensive measures to avoid being persuaded. Right. So, think about when an ad comes on or a telemarketer calls you or you get a spam note on LinkedIn. You avoid it or ignore it. You delete it. You turn off the television. You switch the channel. You do something else. Right. People know ads are trying to convince them, so they react against those messages. Or even worse, they counter argue. Right? Imagine we're in a pitch meeting, for example. We're pitching something. We're saying how great it is. Everyone's listening, but they're not just listening. They're thinking about all the reasons why what we're suggesting is wrong. Same with ads, right? We see the ad that says, oh, the Ford truck does this and that. And we go, of course, Ford's going to say that. They're Ford. Ford's not going to say our truck doesn't work. They're not going to say, Chevy has better towing capacity. And so we're not just listening, we're counter arguing, poking and prodding the argument till it comes crumbling down. And so how can we overcome this anti-persuasion radar? How can we reduce reactants? Well, at the core, what we need to do is allow for agency. We need to give people back some of that sense of freedom and control. What do I mean? Well, we need to stop trying to persuade people and get them to persuade themselves. We need to stop trying to sell people so much, and we need to get them to buy in. Now, I realize that sounds wonderful, but it sounds like it's easier said than done. So let's talk about a couple ways to actually do something like that. And so in the book, I think I talk about 4 or 5. Here I'll mention 2 or 3, but I'm happy to answer questions about the others for folks that have already read at least part of the book. So one strategy I talk about is what's called providing a menu. And I think this one is super easy, can be applied in a range of different situations. Often when we present something, we present one thing. I think you should buy this product. Here's why. I think you should use this service. Here's why. I think we should pursue this course of action. Here's why. We present one option and we list all the reasons why it's a good idea, all the facts and figures and informations and attributes that will encourage people to do something. But as we've talked about, the listener's sitting there going, but really what they're doing is they're saying, nope, this is why it won't work. This is why it's too expensive. This is why it's not as good as what I'm doing already. And so how can we get them to change? Well, great catalysts often don't just present one option, they present multiple. They say, hey, I think you should do X or Y. Which do you like better? And notice what that does. It subtly shifts the role of the listener. Now, rather than sitting there going, okay, let me argue with what you're saying, instead I'm focused on a different job. Now my job is to say, well, which one of these do I like better? And by the way, I'm very excited and happy to think about which one of these I like better. I love sharing my opinion and thinking about my opinion. And so I'm much more likely to focus on the things I like, which means I'm much more likely to pick one of those things at the end of the interaction, right? And you can think about this as providing a menu, because when you go to a restaurant, right, they don't say have whatever you want. They don't give you one option, and they don't say have whatever you want. They give you a limited set of options, in some sense, guided choice that you choose from within, right? They don't say you have to have this, and they don't say you can do whatever you want. They say here's some set of options. Which do you prefer? You don't sit there focusing on all the options you don't have. You focus on the ones that you have. And so we need to give people real choices. Sometimes people say, oh, what if I give people, A and B, and I know they hate B? Well, then it's not really going to work, right? But if you give them 2 real options, both things that they could be excited about, now you're shifting their job and making them more likely they'll choose one of those options at the end of the interaction. Another strategy we can use here is called ask, don't tell. And I think this one is super easy and very useful to apply, again, in a range of settings. Too often, right, we tell people what to do. We make statements. As I talked about, people push back against statements. And so the idea here is to ask questions. There was a startup founder that I was talking to a few years ago, and she was trying to get her colleagues to put in extra hours. There was a big sprint to a launch, and people weren't putting in the time, and they didn't want to work late and stay weekends. And she kept pushing them, telling them what to do. We need to do this. We need to do this. They kept pushing back. So instead, she calls a meeting, and she says, hey, first she starts with a rhetorical question. Hey, what kind of company do we want to be? A good company or a great company? And you know how everyone answers that question? They go, oh, we want to be a great company. And then she asks a real question. Okay, how do we get there? And notice what she's doing. First, rather than telling people how to get there, she's asking them, which is doing a couple things. First, it's shifting the role of the listener. Again, rather than pushing back against statements, they've been asked a question, so they're thinking about answering that question. And so they're more engaged and less likely to push back. But second, it allows her to collect information. Right? Often we don't know enough about the people we're trying to convince to be able to convince them, right? We just use the one size fits all message. We assume if we push on everybody to work, but the more information we have about them and their needs and what they're interested in, the more we can tailor our pitch to them. And so questions allow us to collect that information, allow us to have deeper understanding. But in addition, once people come back with solutions, right, they have the answers to those questions. They say, here's what I think we should do to become a better organization. Nicely, and this is the third thing, it encourages commitment to the conclusion. Because then if someone in that meeting says, I think to make what we these things and become a great organization, we got to put in extra hours. Then when she at the end of the meeting says, great, based on what Tim said, we're going to put in extra hours, it's much harder for him to push back later because he came up with it in the first place, right? It's no longer her idea, it's his idea. Because it's his idea, he's much more excited about going along. I was doing an exec ed session a few weeks ago, and someone said, it's funny, I have a boss and they love feeling like an idea is theirs. I said, it's not just your boss. Everybody loves feeling like an idea is theirs. We want to own our ideas. We don't want to give them away. We feel like if we have ownership of them, we'll get credit for them, and we want credit for them. But if our goal is to get that idea implemented, it's better to actually give it away. Let someone else feel like it's their idea, because if they feel like it's theirs, they're going to be more bought in, more likely to go along. It's going to be easier to implement it than it would be otherwise. Let me give you one more example here, and this is called highlighting a gap. And so I want to show you an example here from an anti-smoking campaign in Thailand from a group called the Thai Health Promotion Foundation. I'm going to show you an ad or a video of theirs. Take a quick look, and then we'll talk about it. So here we go.
ขอไฟหน่อยขอยืมไฟแช็กหน่อย
ดูดเองจริงๆเหรอไม่ให้ฮะจ่าเลยดูดไม่ดีนะเลิกดูดได้มันมียาฆ่าแมลงอยู่ในแมงกุรีด้วยนะดูดแล้วหน้าแก่นะสูบบุหรี่แต่ก็ตายเร็วไม่อยากอยู่เล่นนานๆแล้วมันไม่ดีรู้เปล่าสูบแล้วเป็นทั้งมะเร็งปอดร่มโป่งพองเส้นเลือดในสมองแตก
ไม่ดีแล้วพี่ดูดทำไมล่ะคะ
So this campaign, as mentioned, was hugely effective. 40% increase in calls to the quit line. Videos of this campaign go viral on the web, millions of views around the world. But let's unpack why it worked. So, and by the way, please share some thoughts in the chat if you have them. I'd love to sort of get your thoughts on this as well as we sort of think about why this worked. But I think there's a key insight that the agency and the Thai Health Promotion Foundation realized, which is people weren't smoking because they didn't know it was bad, right? Often anti-smoking campaigns say smoking is bad, lists all the reasons, but smokers knew how bad smoking was. Smokers could tell the kids all the reasons why smoking was a bad idea. They knew more than doctors knew. It wasn't an information problem. They realized if they pushed the smokers would push back and not do it. So instead what they did is they highlighted a gap. Right? And so we want our attitudes and our actions to line up. If I say I care about recycling or the environment, I better recycle. If I say I care about this sports team, I better watch their game. If I tell this kid not to smoke, I better not smoke myself. Right? And when these two things are in disconnect, right, cognitive dissonance occurs, and we do work to reduce the dissonance. We have to bring them in line, right? In this case, they have two options. They can tell the kid to smoke, which they're not going to do, or they can be less likely to smoke themselves, which is what 40% of them actually ended up doing, right? Because this campaign highlighted a gap, right? There are many ways in which our attitudes and actions don't line up, but this campaign highlighted one of them. Right? Smokers would always say no to a kid asking them to smoke, but they had never been asked. Right? And now by encouraging them to be asked and notice the gap, they're more likely to resolve that gap by changing what they're thinking about doing. And so this is a powerful strategy, can be applied in a variety of different areas. I'm going to skip sort of another example here in the interest of time, but I think it's a great way to sort of encourage people to come around to something that they would like but may not have thought about themselves. Okay, I won't have time today to talk about endowment, and I also won't have time to talk about distance, but please check out the workbooks that I mentioned, as well as the book itself, if useful. I will spend less than 10 minutes on uncertainty, and then I'd love to take some questions. And again, I'm skipping a lot of details in these things, but I want to give you guys at least an appetizer for some of the ideas that are in here. And so whenever we're dealing with change, whenever we're trying to get people to do something new, buy a new product, use a new service, adopt a new innovation, there's always some uncertainty, right? They're doing something already. That thing may not be perfect, right? But if it was terrible, they'd already switch. And so they're kind of sticking with it because it's good enough. And you're coming along telling them that there's something better. But they're saying, well, how do I know to trust you? Of course, you'd say it's better. How do I actually know that it's better? And so there's some uncertainty. And not only is there uncertainty, right? The challenge with doing something new is there are always switching costs. Whether we think about them as money, as time, as effort, there's always a cost of change. What do I mean by that? Well, if I have a car and it's paid off, it doesn't cost me more money to own that car. But if I'm going to buy a new car, I've got to pay money to buy that new car. In addition, I've got to do research and figure out which car to buy. I have to figure out where they have it, and I have to engage in some time and effort. Same thing with an online system, right? Let's say I'm switching over from one service provider to another, or one software package to another. I got to do a bunch of work, right? I got to switch over all my information and different things. That takes time and effort. And so these costs of change stymie action. Old stuff, status quo, is cheap. New stuff is costly. But let me tell you, it gets even worse. Think about the costs of change and the benefits of change. So I buy a new car, maybe it drives faster, maybe it gets better gas mileage. I buy a new phone, maybe it has better memory and a better camera, right? Those are the benefits of change. The costs I've mentioned already. When do the costs of change occur? And when do the benefits of change occur? Think about it for a second. Which happens first, the costs of change or the benefits of change? And if you think about it, the costs almost always happen first. People incur the cost, the time, the effort, the money, the energy, whatever it might be. And only once they've incurred the cost do they get a chance of exploring the benefit. Sure, a new phone might be better than my existing phone, but I'm not going to find out till I've paid all those upfront costs. Sure, a new system might be better than my old system, but again, I don't get to find out until I paid all the costs to switch. And so not only are there costs, which is bad, not only the costs now and the benefits are later, which is worse, but even more, the costs are pretty certain and the benefits are pretty uncertain. I know for sure that I'm going to have to incur at least these costs to do something new. And you're saying that this thing might be better than the old thing I'm doing, but I don't know, and I'm going to have to pay all those costs to find out. This is called the cost-benefit timing gap. And the uncertainty chapter is one reason I wrote this new book. So I came out with a book called Contagious, 8 years ago now, worked with a lot of companies and organizations based on that book, applied things from Contagious, but always went back to some of these ideas that became the uncertainty chapter, because I think it's a powerful set of concepts that are not in Contagious, right? This cost-benefit timing gap is so key to any new product adoption, new service adoption challenge, right? People are stuck with what they're doing. They like it enough. The new thing is actually better objectively once you get them over the hump, but they don't want to pay the cost to get over the hump. And so how do we address that? How do we solve it? I'm going to skip a couple examples here. You can read about them in the book, but sort of how do we get them to unpause, right? How do we get them to move beyond what they're doing already? So Dropbox is a nice example of a solution to this problem. And so you guys might be familiar with Dropbox, sort of $1 billion business, cloud storage solution. Today, we think of them as very successful. They must be successful. I mean, they're $1 billion business. It must have been really easy for them to get traction. Far from it. They had a lot of trouble getting traction when they started. They didn't have many new users. They were thinking about buying keywords, spending a bunch of money on advertising, wasn't getting the traction they wanted. And so they ended up doing something different. They gave away the service for free. They gave away 2 gigabytes of storage on Dropbox for free. And you'd say, well, hold on, how do you build a $1 billion business giving away something for free? Obviously, consumers like free stuff, but you can't build a brand by giving things for free. But they didn't just give away storage for free. They harnessed something called freemium. Many of you guys are probably familiar with freemium. In case you're not, it's a combination of 2 words, free and premium. There's often a free version or a reduced price version of a product or service, and there's a premium version that you can upgrade to. And so Dropbox didn't just give something away for free. They harnessed freemium, right? They said, hey, there's 2 gigabytes of storage for free, but if you want more storage, you want additional features, you got to pay to do that, right? Hundreds, if not thousands, there's no way to count them all, of companies have harnessed the idea of freemium, right? So Zoom uses freemium, LinkedIn uses freemium, Skype uses freemium, Dropbox uses freemium, the New York Times uses freemium, Pandora uses freemium. Almost every software as a service business uses freemium in one way or another. And again, it's clear why consumers like freemium. It's free, but brands like it as well. Why? Because the key challenge is uncertainty, and freemium lowers the barrier to trial. I can say how great I am till I'm blue in the face, but consumers aren't necessarily going to believe me. But if I give something away, or at least lower the barrier to trial and allow them to experience it, they can see themselves that it's good. And once they see that it's good, they'll be happy to pay the money because they've been using Dropbox and hit the storage limit. And so really successful strategy for companies to use. Now, a few years ago, I started singing the praises of freemium, as many people have, and sort of working with brands to apply it. There's a whole appendix, by the way, in the back of the book on freemium if you're interested in the tactics of making freemium work, and I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. But some clients I work with said, well, hold on, I get how you do freemium for software as a service, but what about physical goods, right? What if I'm a doctor? How do I do freemium? What if I'm a hospital system? How do I do freemium? What if I'm a fleet management company? What if I'm a car dealer? What if I'm anything that's a physical good? Candy bars. How do you do freemium for candy bars, right? I mean, there's no freemium, no free version, premium version. So freemium seems useful in some situations, but not many others. But freemium is actually just one example of a much broader principle. And the principle is not freemium itself. The principle is lowering the barrier to trial, right? So think about when you go to a car dealership and you're interested in a new car. Imagine they said, hey, great, you want a new car? Pay us $30,000 and we'll let you check out the car. You'd say, no way. I'm not going to pay you all this money before I know if I want the car, right? Notice, by the way, this is what we're asking all our potential customers and clients to do. Trust us, it's great. Pay us all the upfront costs, and then we'll give you the benefits. So what do car dealers do? We know what they do. They give test drives, right? Now, test drives aren't freemium. There's no free version of the car in premium, but it's part of this broader principle, which is lowering the barrier to trial, reducing the upfront costs, speeding the experience of the value of the offering, allowing people to experience themselves, decide they like it, and then be more willing to pay for it. Free shipping does the same thing. I don't want to have to pay to figure out if I'm going to like a product. Free shipping solves that problem. Sampling solves that problem. Renting rather than buying solves that problem. Many more examples of sort of versions of lowering the barrier to trial in the book. But the idea here is simple. It's not about freemium. It's about making it easier for people to experience the value of the offering. Let me give you one more example of this. I'm going to skip that one more, and then I'll wrap up. I love lowering the barrier to trial, but there's one problem. Say you're a car dealer, you're Acura, you give test drives. That's great, but who takes the test drive? Well, only a segment of consumers, the segment of people that know Acura exists, so they're aware of the brand, and that think they would like the brand. What about all the other people that have never heard of the brand or know of the brand but don't think they'd like it? This is the exact problem Acura had about a decade ago, right? People who liked Acura, loved the brand, they went back and bought a second and a third one, but there weren't enough people like that. They were doing test drives, but not enough people were coming in. And so they came up with a really clever solution. They worked with W Hotels and said, hey, anyone staying in a W Hotel can get a ride in an Acura for free. You don't need to be in the car market. You don't need to want a new car. You just need to get a ride to your meeting or the airport or wherever it is. We'll give you a ride for free. Now, did everyone take a ride in Acura? No, but hundreds of thousands of people did. Did all of them buy an Acura in the end? No, but tens of thousands of them did. Why? Because this program drove discovery. It brought the trial to people. Rather than forcing people to opt into something that they might not have known about or not thought they'd like, right? This brought the trial to people. And more likely to try means more likely to buy. The more we can facilitate trial through opt-in trial, people have to come to us, or bringing the trial to them, embedding trial in an experience they're already doing, the more effective we're going to be. And there's lots of examples of this in the book. I love this strategy. I've applied it with a bunch of different clients. I think it's a really powerful way to not only lower the barrier to trial, but to bring that trial to folks. Okay, I want to wrap up and take some questions. I want to save some time for questions. So as we've discussed, catalysts reduce roadblocks. I've talked briefly about 2 of the 5 roadblocks, talked about reactants and uncertainty. Feel free to read more about endowment, distance, and corroborating evidence. All of these barriers are powerful. The more we understand them, the better off we'll be. 2 key next steps from this talk. First, find the parking brakes. I've talked about 5 today. You may have thought of a 6th one or a 7th one. Totally fine. We are blind to the barriers. Going to be really hard to change behavior, whether that's consumer behavior, customer behavior, colleague behavior, organizational behavior, whatever it might be, if we don't understand the barriers. So let's be better at finding them. And in case it's helpful, there's a free application guide on my website, just jonahberger.com/resources, that you can download and work on with your teams. So whether it's reducing reactants, whether it's easing uncertainty and thinking about how to do that, or other aspects of the framework. Because again, it's not random, it's not luck, and it's not chance. There's a science behind why people change and why they don't. If we understand that science, we can build more effective messages and ideas. We can be better catalysts. And at the core, we can change anything. So thank you guys so much. Appreciate your time and interest. I am now going to turn to the chat and the Q&A thing. I don't know if these have been curated already, so give me a second to sort of go there. But if you have questions, please throw them in the chat or the Q&A function, and I will look at them shortly. So give me just a second. Okay, so Abigail has a question. What would have been a better strategy to get people to wear masks to reduce reactants? Thank you for asking, Abigail. So I actually wrote a piece in HBR, probably about 6-8 months, maybe even a year ago now, on exactly this. And I talked a lot about some of the strategies we talked about today, right? So take masks, for example. Rather than telling people you need to wear a mask, say something like, hey, imagine your kids are around or your elderly parents or grandparents around. Would you want other people to wear masks? That question, right? If someone says yes, then you say, okay, well then why aren't you wearing one? Don't tell them not to wear a mask, right? It's their choice, but encourage them, guide that journey to the place where they go, huh, interesting. I wish other people were wearing masks around the people I love. Why aren't I wearing a mask? Encouraging them to get there themselves. And so that's just one example. There were a number of others in the piece. If you type in my name at HBR, hopefully you should be able to find it. But there's a couple things there that should be useful. Let me go to another question here. Vaccine adoption. How do you think groups can use the principles of your book, The Catalyst, to meet people where they are? Yeah. So, I mean, I would say very similar things to what I just said. So I don't want to sound like a broken record, but again, like, would you want people around your loved ones to be vaccinated? Okay, great. Well, if so, why aren't you getting vaccinated? So that's highlighting a gap. Using questions to sort of shape what attention they're paying to, or what things they're paying attention to. So I think the tactics are very much the same, but how we might apply them might be slightly different. Okay, Malcolm has a question here. Do you think there are certain industries that benefit from having hard to persuade consumers as their primary base? Industries that benefit from having hard, I mean, I think there's obviously variation in how hard to persuade consumers are. I think a benefit in some way is that once we get those consumers, they're ours. And so they're less likely to move to someone else. And so I think there certainly is variation in how hard consumers are to change in different industries. I also think in time periods, right? I mean, many of the clients I'm working with, I talk about COVID as a big opportunity. Why? Well, obviously there's a lot of challenges, lots of uncertainty, lots of difficulty, but people hate change. People don't want to change. People would like not to change, yet they've been forced to change over the past year. And so they've been forced to stay at home rather than go to work. They've been forced to shop online rather than shop in stores. They've been forced to do education at home and exercise at home and all these things. And so it's an opportunity before their habits go back to calcifying either the way they were or the way they have changed given the pandemic. Now is really the opportunity to shift their behavior. I think it's a good example is like, think about snow, right? If any of you have ever shoveled a walk with snow on it, once it snows and it sits for a half a day overnight, it becomes really hard to move. Once that snow solidifies and becomes ice, it's going to be tough to change. But if we get out there early with our shovel before it's turned to ice, it's pretty easy to move. And so I think consumer behavior is like that at the moment. People have been forced to change. Now is a big opportunity to move them a little bit in one way or another, really use these trial programs and other things, test drives, to make it easier for people to change. And it may be worth spending the money now on customer acquisition costs, because I think it'll pay off in the long term. Okay, let me see other questions here. What is the biggest resistance that people have to make decisions that we often miss looking at? Not completely sure I understand. What is the biggest resistance that people have to make decisions that we often miss looking at? Yeah, I mean, I think I've talked a little bit about that today. Sometimes I get asked the question, oh, there are 5 of these. Which one is the one most important one? And that's sort of a false question, right? If you're hoping that there's one silver bullet that in 15 seconds will solve every problem you have, I wish that was true. When you find it, let me know. But each of these are important in different situations. And I think the main skill I think we can get better at is recognizing the barriers, right? Is this a reactance problem? Is this a distance problem where we're asking for so much from where people are currently? And this is also relevant to both the vaccine stuff and the mask stuff. When we ask for so much from where people are currently, they disregard us. Confirmation bias kicks in. They're not even willing to listen. And so we often need to, in some sense, chunk the change or break down big change into smaller chunks, ask for less and then ask for more. And so the distance chapter is all about kind of how we can find out where people are in a spectrum of beliefs and stay within their latitude of acceptance rather than moving beyond that to the zone of region of rejection, and using that to make change easier. Let's see another question. The Care by Volvo subscription models, a reframe of the leasing strategy, reduces reactants. Yeah, so I'm not 100% familiar with that model, though I have talked to both automakers and others about sort of new models about thinking of cars and vehicles. And I think, one, trial is happening in a lot of areas, which is great to see. And two, I think these models are also better understanding consumers and the segments of them that there are, right? Some people, I'm in this bucket, don't care that much about cars. I have an old car. I'm happy to keep that old car. When I get a new car, I'll keep that car for a long time until it becomes an old car. Other people are really interested in changing their cars, or they have different needs at different points in time. And subscription models may be a much better fit for them. They only need it for a period. They have different needs in different periods. And so I think that model, regardless of what else it does, helps the brand appeal to different customer segments. But I also think it reduces reactance, right? Maybe I don't know whether I'd like a station wagon or an SUV, and I'm not sure. Well, let me check out this car and see how I like it and whether it works for my needs. Great. Let me see. Good question. So someone asked, do these principles vary by people's historic relationship with companies and systems? For example, African Americans have been historically discriminated against by financial services and pharma. Yeah, so I was talking to some folks in the U.S. government that deal a lot with nursing homes and this challenge of getting home health aides or nursing home aides to get vaccinated, many of which are sort of underrepresented minorities, many of them who say, yeah, sure, you say this is safe, but you also said a bunch of things were safe decades ago. How do I know to actually believe you? And so, I think some of the more recent campaigns around vaccines that have happened have been a little bit more like, hey, we know you're skeptical. We know there are challenges. We know you have questions. Let's ask those questions and have a conversation. Right? Rather than saying, hey, do this, say, hey, what are your questions? Great. If you have this question, go here. If you have this question, go here. Here's more information that you can collect that puts you in the driver's seat, recognizes you want to be in the driver's seat. And I think that's valuable for everyone, anyone who's sort of a vaccine, either are skeptic or uncertain, but particularly valuable for underrepresented minorities who have been discriminated against or had things happen in the past that were not really fair or above board, and may have reasons to be skeptical about this new thing. Okay, let me see here. Great. So I see a comment from Hannibal. You mentioned that candy bars are a product type that can't necessarily offer trial. I didn't mean it can't. I meant it's harder to think of it. But you know how ice cream shops offer trial with free samples, reduce the barrier to food trial. Does food relate more to one catalyst than another? Yeah. So I love food trial. I love trial in the grocery store. I love trial at festivals. There was an article in Adweek, I think, recently talking about trial programs during the pandemic and using Airbnb and VRBOs to encourage trial. I've been a big fan for a long time of any way you can encourage trial, right? You go to a hotel, there are trials of shampoos and conditioners and toothpaste. You fly in an airplane, sometimes they give you a little pack of different things that you can try. There are clothing brands now that you stay at certain hotels, and they will put clothes in your wardrobe, and if you like them, you take them with you and you buy them. If you don't, you leave them there. I think if we haven't thought about ways to encourage trial of whatever we're doing, we are missing out on a big opportunity. And so whatever it is that you represent or working on, I think trials definitely worth doing. Michael says, all the experts, I like this in quotes, thank you, say that in the future we have to change constantly at work, at home, retraining, redefining. What are the implications of thesis? Deep-seated change resistance in the human animal? Yeah. I'm always a little bit wary of big proclamations. And I think it's always more exciting to say everything is different than it used to be, rather than saying that things are changing, 5 to 10% at a time, and we're moving forward. I don't know that in the future we'll have to change constantly. I think that there will be more change than there is now. But I don't know if we may become more comfortable with change. I don't think the status quo bias will ever disappear, right? We just have more information about old stuff than new stuff, right? The product we have is feels safer than the product we don't. This is why I also love free shipping, right? If I'm uncertain if I want a pair of shoes, the status quo is to, do nothing, right? I don't buy the shoes, I don't have them. Once they're in my house, free shipping gets them in my house. Now I've got to decide to make them leave. And that requires some effort, and it takes advantage of the status quo bias and leads me to keep something, not because I wouldn't like it. Right? If I really don't like it, I can get rid of it, but because it takes advantage of those sort of biases in human behavior. There's a question, is endowment about the endowment effect from behavioral economics? Yes and no. It's about attachment to things we have already, so it's certainly related to the endowment effect, but I would say the endowment effect is only part of it. Let me see if there's maybe one or two more questions. Maybe one or two more while we're here, either from the Olson Zaltman folks or from the attendees. Any other
Jonah, this is James for Sophia had some internet connectivity problems, so she had to drop off. But I'll throw one your way.
Perfect.
All the different tools that you talk about in the book, it's not always a linear connection to say, well, do X and Y will happen. It almost feels like sometimes it's more of a experimental thing. Do X, Y might happen. Do W, Y might happen. So if you're a business, how do you sort of manage that and figure out which lever we need to pull to get this behavioral change that we want? Because theoretically, there are a lot of different factors that could be at play and a lot of different things that theoretically could work.
Yeah, I mean, I think my answer to this question would be understand your customer, your client, your consumer, whether that is a true customer or, whether the doctor is your customer, whether patients are your customers, whether your colleagues are the customer, and think about that customer journey, just like we usually think about sort of awareness, consideration, purchase, whatever it might be, and think about what the barriers are in that journey. And the barriers may not be the same for everyone. So, I was doing a project a couple of years ago with a B2B software company that finds machine parts. So imagine you have a bunch of backhoes and bulldozers and they're down because they need parts and you need to find parts. It helps you find parts faster, so you reduce downtime and reduce cost of parts. And so we sort of went through the customer journey, but rather than think about, okay, like what do we need to give people? Instead, we said, well, what are the barriers? Right. So for some people, the barrier was awareness. I don't know this exists. Great. We've got to tell them this exists. Another barrier might be, it exists, but you don't think you have the problem. Right. Well, then we need to raise attention to the problem. Another set of people might be aware that they have the problem, but might think it costs too much. Another set of people might not think that it costs too much, but are worried about how it integrates with their existing systems. And so while you're right that before we do this research, we may not know which of these things are going to have an effect. Once we do some good customer insight work, we can have a sense of what the barriers are and which segments certain barriers are more prevalent. And that then can allow us to engage in certain initiatives, right? So if the barrier for a certain group is it costs too much, great, then we can do an introductory offer, lowering the barrier to trial, like we talked about uncertainty. If, on the other hand, the barriers, well, I don't know if this is going to integrate with my existing systems, we can actually raise the price and create a version of a white glove service where we're going to come in and make sure it integrates with your systems and solve that problem. And so, when we go to the doctor's office, the doctor doesn't just say, well, I'm going to put a cast on your leg. No, the doctor says, okay, well, tell me what the problem is. And once I understand the problem, I can go ahead and provide a solution. And so I think the same thing here. We really have to start by understanding the problem. And that's really where great sort of customer insight work comes in. And I think really where a lot of opportunity is.
Do you have time for a couple more?
I will take one more. You can queue up whichever one it is. I will take one more.
Let's take one more. Leaders in industry, I'll just read it verbatim. Leaders in industry are wary about innovating, experimenting, and piloting new ideas lest it upset the established cash cow product. Failure is a big disincentive. How do you overcome that?
Yeah. So this reminds me of something I talk a lot about in the endowment chapter. I teach the introduction to marketing at Wharton. So I'm the head of the core, that sort of introductory marketing course for 900 of our students. And we teach a case in that class about a beer brand. And they have a cash cow lager business, and they're thinking about introducing a light beer, but they're worried introducing a light beer will scare away their lager customers because a light beer seems, frilly and young, and it'll scare away the blue collar drinkers of this lager beer. And so they're really worried about the damage that this light beer might have. But lager sales are declining, not by a lot, but by 2% a year. And 2% a year isn't a lot. But if you compound that over a few years, in 5 years, you're losing 32% of your revenue. And so doing nothing feels really safe, right? It's only a small hole in the bottom of my boat, right? I shouldn't jump off the boat and go swimming. I should stay in the boat because it's only a small hole. But if you wait long enough, that small hole is going to fill your boat up with water and you're going to sink. And so I think there's that old saying, what got you here won't get you there. I think many brands sort of have a cash cow product and they don't want to mess with it. They say, look, I don't want to cannibalize. I don't want to mess with it. It's my leader of the business. But if you don't cannibalize yourself, someone else will. Right? I remember seeing some great data from Gillette where they introduce a new razor even before sales of their old razor have died off. Why? Because they know if they don't introduce a new razor, someone else is going to. Their competitors will. And they'd rather they introduce it and catalyze themselves and keep it within the family rather than letting someone else do it. And so I think the same thing is true here. We all have this attachment to the past, this endowment. Doing nothing feels safe. It's not as safe as we might think. And so we really need to highlight the cost of inaction to help people realize that, change is sometimes safer than just doing nothing. Awesome. Well, thank you guys. I hope you enjoy the book and found it valuable. I threw a quick link in the chat to the resources, so please check those out. My email address is up on the screen, as is my Twitter handle. Feel free to reach out if there's anything I do to help. And otherwise, thanks so much, and hope these ideas are helpful on your journey. So thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Jonah. Really appreciate you sharing this with us. I know all of us at Olson Zaltman were really eager to hear from you today, especially because we had our book club discussion. So thank you so much. For everybody who's watching, this will be shared. We recorded it, so we will be in touch with you shortly. So thank you to everybody. I know I can see a bunch of comments in the chat with a lot of thanks. So just appreciate you guys participating and listening, and hope everyone has a wonderful day.